Millions of people have seen these 4 letters their entire lives and never stop to ask why they matter. INRI. They are carved into crucifixes, painted above Jesus in old churches, etched into rosaries, hanging in hospitals, in prisons, in homes, in chapels, in places where people cry, pray, hope, and hold on. 4 letters, and most people assume they are just a religious decoration. But they are not. Those 4 letters come from the sign that was placed above the head of Jesus while he was dying. And the deeper you look at that sign, the more unsettling it becomes. Because what was hanging above him that day was not only a Roman label. It was not only public mockery. It was not only a legal notice. It was a message so sharp that the religious leaders did not ask for the cross to be taken down. They asked for the wording to be changed. Think about that. Jesus had already been beaten, already condemned, already nailed up in public. And yet the priests were still disturbed by one thing hanging above his head. Not his wounds, not the crowd, not even the execution itself. The words, and maybe that is where this begins to get personal for you. Because sometimes what looks like the darkest moment is also the moment heaven is saying the clearest thing. Sometimes what looks like humiliation is carrying a declaration. Sometimes what looks like loss is the very place where truth is being written in public. And if you have ever gone through a season where your life made no sense, where pain felt louder than promise, where God seemed silent while everything around you looked like collapse, then what happened over the head of Jesus may change the way you read your whole season. Because at Calvary God allowed suffering to be seen, but he also allowed truth to remain visible above it. And that changes everything. Let us go there slowly. It is Passover in Jerusalem. The city is swollen with pilgrims. The streets are full. The temple is busy. The air is tense. Rome is watching. Religion is stirred up, and outside the city, near a road where people can see clearly, 3 crosses stand under the open sky. This is not hidden. Rome does not crucify people in private when it wants to make a point. Rome crucifies in public. Rome wants bodies to preach fear. Rome wants shame to be visible. Rome wants the road to become a warning. And there, in the center, hangs Jesus. Above him is a sign. John tells us that Pilate wrote it and had it placed on the cross. And what did it say? Niwanderlo. Ne Woros, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. That is the line the world remembers. That is where INRI comes from in Latin, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. At first glance it sounds simple, almost too simple, almost too simple, a name and a charge, a label and a mockery. Rome saying, this is what happens to anyone who threatens imperial order. But that is not all it was. Because John does not present that sign merely like a criminal charge sheet. He presents it as a title, and that matters more than most people realize. A charge tells you what someone has done. A title tells you who someone is. And this is where the ground starts to move. Pilate did not write, this man claimed to be king. He did not write, this criminal said he was king. He did not write, executed for treason. He wrote, King of the Jews. No quotation marks, no distance, no alleged, no protection, no softening, not a claim, a statement. And the priests heard the difference immediately. Because when they came to Pilate, according to John, they did not say, take the sign down. They said, in effect, do not write, the King of the Jews. Write instead, he said, I am King of the Jews. That difference is everything. Because one wording makes Jesus sound delusional, the other makes him sound true. One wording turns him into a pretender, the other presents him as a king. One wording protects the leaders from the meaning of the moment. The other lets the meaning stand there over his bleeding head for the whole city to read. And Pilate refused. What I have written, I have written. That answer sounds cold, almost irritated, but it also sounds final, like a door slammed shut. So why did Pilate refuse? Part of the answer is political. Pilate and the religious leaders were not friends. They had a history of tension, resentment, and pressure. By the time Jesus stood before him, Pilate was cornered. He found no real guilt in Jesus, yet he gave him over anyway under pressure, fear, and threat. The leaders pushed him where he did not want to go. So this sign may have been his last little act of revenge. You made me crucify your man. Then I will write your king over his head. You wanted blood? Then live with the wording. You wanted Rome to kill him? Then Rome will also name him. Pilate may have intended it as mockery, spite, and political insult. But heaven can use even bitter hands. That is one of the mysteries of this story. Pilate may not have believed what he wrote, but what he wrote was still true. And if you have ever wondered whether God can still move through people who do not understand him, through circumstances that do not honor him, through systems that do not love him, look at that sign. A pagan governor wrote something truer than he knew. And that means your life is never at the mercy of human intention alone. God is able to make even opposition carry witness. God is able to let a Roman hand write a sentence that hell itself would have preferred to erase. And the more you stay with this moment, the more breathtaking it becomes. Because the sign was not written in only one language. It was written in three, Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. That detail can sound small until you feel its weight. 3 languages over one bleeding man. Why? Why go to the trouble? Why write it 3 times? Why not simply use Latin, the official language of Roman authority? Why not just Greek, the language many could understand across the empire? Why add multiple lines above a crucified man unless the intention was that nobody should miss what was being declared? That day, Jerusalem was full of people from many places because of Passover. Different regions, different accents, different backgrounds, but those 3 languages covered the worlds that mattered in that moment. Hebrew, or more precisely the Jewish linguistic world, carried covenant, scripture, worship, temple memory, the story of God and his people. Greek carried thought, philosophy, culture, commerce, the language of the wider Mediterranean world. Latin carried imperial authority, law, military power, political rule. Do you see what is happening? Power, wisdom, revelation, all standing under one sky, all represented over one cross, the empire, the nations, the covenant people, all brought face to face with Jesus. That sign did not only tell people who was dying, it told the world who was in the center. And maybe this is why the cross was never a local tragedy only. It was not a private collapse in a forgotten province. It was the axis of history. It was where every world met. It was where the deepest truth about God and the deepest truth about man collided in public. The rulers thought they were disposing of a problem. The priests thought they were ending a threat. The crowd thought they were watching another execution. But heaven was making a declaration in 3 languages. That matters for you more than you may think, because one of the enemy's most effective lies is to convince you that your pain is random, private, meaningless, and disconnected from the larger story of God. That what you are carrying is just your burden, just your confusion, just your closed door, just your long night. But the cross reminds you that when God is writing something, it is never smaller than it appears. What looked like one man dying outside one city was in fact the center of redemption for the world. And what looks small in your life may still be held inside a much larger purpose than you can currently see. Now here is where the tension deepens, because the sign above Jesus did not simply communicate information. It created discomfort, real discomfort, and not in everyone equally. The ones most disturbed were the religious leaders. Again, this should trouble you. Why were they so troubled by wording? They had already pushed for crucifixion. They had already won what they thought they wanted. Jesus was dying. His disciples were scattered. His body was hanging in public shame. Why keep fighting over a sentence? Because words matter when they start sounding like truth. Because there are moments when people can tolerate suffering more easily than meaning. They could bear to see him killed. They could not bear to see him named. And there is a hard spiritual lesson inside that. The flesh will often tolerate religion as long as truth is weakened. People are comfortable with Jesus as symbol, teacher, healer, inspiration, even tragedy. But when Jesus is named king, something sharper happens. Because king is not just a compliment. King is a claim. King means authority. King means allegiance. King means your life is not your own final reference point. King means your fear is not sovereign. King means Caesar is not. King means the empire does not get the last word. King means pain does not interpret reality by itself. King means God has the right to define what your season means, even when your feelings are screaming something else. And this is one reason the wording was unbearable, not because it was poetic, because it was dangerous. Now there is another layer here that many believers have heard about, and it deserves careful handling. Some have pointed out that in one possible Hebrew rendering of the phrase, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, the first letters can be read in a way that resembles thy divine name, the sacred name of God. That idea has stirred people for a long time because of how explosive it would be. The thought that above the head of Jesus, in public view, the very initials could point toward the divine name itself. Now let us be honest and careful. Scripture directly tells us that the sign was written, that the priests wanted it changed, and that Pilate refused. That part is solid. The exact Hebrew acrostic argument is not stated plainly in the biblical text, and scholars do debate the specifics of the wording and whether the initials work necessarily in every reconstruction. So we should not speak beyond what Scripture clearly says. But here is what we do know with certainty. The priests were alarmed by the wording. Deeply alarmed, and whatever all the reasons were, they understood that the sign over Jesus was saying something about identity that they did not want publicly fixed in place. That is enough to shake you. They were not merely resisting a sentence, they were resisting the meaning of who he was, and that kind of resistance did not end in the 1st century. People still wanted Jesus who inspires, but does not reign. A Jesus who comforts but does not confront. A Jesus who blesses but does not rule. A Jesus who can heal pain but cannot name truth. A Jesus you can admire without surrendering to, but the cross will not let him remain that manageable. Because even in his suffering, he is named as King, not after resurrection only, not only after heaven opens, not only after the nations bow right there while bleeding, while mocked, while rejected, while looking to natural eyes like anything but a king. That is one of the deepest reversals in the gospel. Jesus looked least royal when he was being most clearly enthroned by heaven's logic. And this is where your own life may need reframing. Maybe you have been interpreting your hardest season only through appearance. Maybe because the door closed, you assumed God stepped back. Maybe because the prayer has taken so long, you assumed heaven is not moving. Maybe because your strength feels thin, you assumed your story is shrinking. Maybe because things look less impressive, you assumed God is less present. But Calvary tells you something entirely different. The place that looked most like defeat became the place where truth stood in public. The place that looked like shame became the place of revelation. The place that looked like the end, it became the place history was being rewritten. So perhaps what feels like contradiction in your life is not proof that God is absent. Perhaps it is proof that you do not yet know what title He is allowing to stand over this season. Now stay here, because the irony becomes even more devastating. The same leaders who objected to the title above Jesus had already spoken one of the saddest lines in the Passion narrative. We have no king but Caesar. Think about what that means. Men who represented the covenant people, men who guarded the temple, men who handled sacred words, men who taught the scriptures, men who should have been waiting for the Messiah, and under pressure. In the moment of decision, they chose Caesar over Christ. This is not just ancient failure, it is living warning. Because you can know religious language and still enthrone the wrong ruler in your heart. You can stand near sacred things and still choose fear. You can sing about God and still bow to what feels safer. You can say you belong to heaven and still let anxiety, control, approval, money, image, bitterness, or human power function as your real king. That is why this story is not just about what they did. It is about what we do. What Caesar are you tempted to crown because trusting Jesus feels too costly right now? What power have you been calling wisdom? What fear have you been obeying like a master? What voice has been interpreting your life more loudly than God's truth? This is where many people lose heart. Not only in suffering itself, but in the wrong interpretation of suffering, because once pain becomes your king, it begins naming everything. It names you forgotten. It names you late. It names you damaged. It names you passed over. It names you disqualified. It names you abandoned. And if you do not challenge that interpretation, you will begin living under a title God never wrote over you. But above Jesus, at the darkest point, another title remained. King. That means pain did not have the final naming rights. Rome did not have the final naming rights. The priests did not have the final naming rights. The crowd did not have the final naming rights. And neither does your present confusion over your own life. Now there is another detail that should humble you. Throughout the crucifixion story, the truth about Jesus keeps slipping out of the mouths of people who do not fully understand what they are saying. Pilate writes king. The soldiers dress him in royal mockery. They put a robe on him. They place a crown on his head, though made of thorns. They kneel in cruel parody. The crowd challenges him with kingly language. Even the accusation itself circles around royalty. It is as if God is forcing history to speak the truth, even through hostile lips. That should encourage you more than you know, because sometimes you think the validation of God's work in your life has to come from friendly voices, from obvious support, from ideal conditions, from a perfect atmosphere. But God is not limited like that. He can make the very situation built to shame you become a witness. He can make the very place of pressure reveal identity. He can let a mock crown preach a true kingship. He can let a cross become a throne. He can let nails speak louder than applause. He can let endurance say what escape never could. That matters because many people imagine power only one way. If Jesus is powerful, then why not come down? If he is king, why stay there? If he is beloved, why does he look forsaken? If God is in this, why does it hurt like this? These are human questions, real questions, honest questions, but the cross gives a holy answer, because Jesus is not the kind of king who proves power by avoiding suffering. He proves power by transforming it. He is not the kind of king who saves himself first. He saves others first. He is not the kind of king who uses authority to preserve comfort. He uses authority to pour out love. And that means the deepest work of God in your life may not always look like instant escape. Sometimes it looks like holy endurance. Sometimes it looks like staying faithful in the place where your flesh wants to run. Sometimes it looks like not coming down early. Sometimes it looks like remaining under the weight until the work is finished. That is a word for someone listening right now. You keep asking, God, if you are with me, why am I still here? And maybe the answer is not punishment. Maybe the answer is purpose. Maybe the answer is that the place you most want to leave is the place where love is doing its deepest work in you. Maybe this is not the season where God proves himself by removing the cross quickly. Maybe this is the season where he proves himself by keeping truth visible above it. And that is not the deepest part yet, because people also get troubled by the gospel accounts of the inscription. One gospel phrases it one way, another slightly differently. One says, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." Another says, "The King of the Jews." Another gives a fuller line, and some people read that and think, is that a contradiction? But not if you remember the sign was in 3 languages. Different witnesses can preserve different forms of the same inscription. Different writers can emphasize different aspects. That is not the collapse of credibility. It is what you would expect when a multilingual public sign is remembered by multiple voices. The core meaning remains unchanged. Jesus, Nazareth, King, Jews, the heart of the message stands, and maybe that matters for you in another way too. Because sometimes you panic when the details in your life do not line up the way you expected. This person sees your season one way. You feel it another way. The outside narrative says one thing. Your private prayer life says another. But truth does not disappear because perspectives differ. Jesus was still king, whether the wording was remembered with fuller or shorter phrasing. And God is still God over your story, even when not everyone around you understands what they are seeing. Now let us step back and feel the scene one more time. The sun over Jerusalem, the road filled with movement, the noise of Passover, dust in the air, blood on wood, a dying man in the center, and above him, in the languages of covenant, culture, and empire, one sentence is allowed to remain. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Why does that move me so deeply? Because it means God did not wait for Easter morning to let truth exist. He let truth stand while it still hurt. He let truth stand before the darkness lifted. He let truth stand while the body was still bleeding. He let truth stand while mockery was still loud. He let truth stand while the disciples were still broken. That is grace for your own season, because many of us think truth only counts after resolution, after healing, after breakthrough, after the prayer is answered, after the door opens, after the marriage recovers, after the grief softens, after the provision comes, after the anxiety eases. Then we will say God was present. Then we will say he was faithful. Then we will say he was working. But Calvary confronts that habit. God let the truth be declared before visible victory appeared. And if he did that there, then maybe you do not have to wait until everything is fixed to believe. He is still writing something true over your life now. Maybe the waiting is not proof of absence. Maybe the silence is not proof of neglect. Maybe the cross-shaped season is not proof of rejection. Maybe the visible pain and the invisible truth are coexisting in ways you have not yet learned to read. That is why I want to say this carefully to the person who feels exhausted. You are not tired only because life is hard. You are tired because you have been trying to interpret your whole life by what hurts most. And pain is a real witness, but it is not a trustworthy king. Pain tells you something happened. It does not always tell you what it means. The cross proves that, if you had stood there and interpreted only by surface appearance, you would have concluded that evil won, truth lost, power triumphed, and love failed. But above the whole bloody scene, God allowed a title to stand that contradicted the appearance. King, not defeated; king, not discarded; king, not abandoned to meaninglessness; king. And that means in your life, too, the appearance is not the whole argument. What you feel is real, but it is not exhaustive. What you see is painful, but it is not final. What looks delayed is not automatically denied. What feels buried is not necessarily dead. What feels silent is not necessarily empty. Sometimes the truest thing in your season is not what the wound says. It is what God says above it, and that is why you must be careful what title you accept. Do not let the enemy name you by your hardest month. Do not let fear name you by your unanswered prayer. Do not let disappointment name you by your closed door. Do not let the pace of your breakthrough name you forgotten. Do not let betrayal name you unwanted. Do not let grief name you finished. Do not let your wilderness name God absent, because above the place of greatest contradiction, God has a way of leaving a title that the world did not expect. And here is the beauty of Jesus in this story. He never argued for the sign. He did not come down to defend the wording. He did not rescue himself to prove the title. He remained. That silence is holy. He remained because he did not need to escape to be king. He remained because truth does not panic. He remained because love was finishing something. He remained because redemption required endurance. He remained because the Lamb was also the king. And his throne in that moment looked like wood and nails before it looked like heaven and glory. And if you are in a season where obedience feels hidden, where faithfulness feels uncelebrated, where staying close to God has not made life easier yet, remember him there, the King who stayed, the King who did not confuse delay with defeat, the King who did not measure truth by surface appearance, the King who let the worst-looking hour carry the clearest declaration. That means your story is not safest when it is easiest. Your story is safest when it is in the hands of the King. And the King revealed at Calvary is not fragile. He is not anxious. He is not improvising. He is not losing. He is not surprised by the resistance around you. He is not threatened by human schemes. He is not dependent on perfect circumstances to tell the truth. He can let truth stand over a cross, so he can let truth stand over your season too. Now I want to land this where your heart actually lives. Maybe you are in a long hallway season. Maybe doors have shut, and you do not know which one will ever open again. Maybe you are still showing up to church, still praying, still trying, but inside you are more tired than anyone knows. Maybe you have watched other people get their breakthrough while you are still in the same quiet room asking the same questions. Maybe you are carrying a grief that made the whole world sound distant. Maybe what hurts most is not the delay itself, but the fear that heaven has gone quiet over your name. If that is where you are, hear this gently. The silence of God is not always the absence of God. At the cross, heaven was not absent. Heaven was establishing the deepest victory in history. It just did not look like victory to the natural eye. So do not assume that because your season feels stripped down, God is not doing something deep. Do not assume that because the road is public and painful, God has stopped guarding your story. Do not assume that because mockery is loud, truth is weak. Do not assume that because your heart is bruised, your King is distant. He is still king in the place that hurts. He is still Lord in the place you do not understand. He is still writing truth where others only see pain. And maybe this is your reframe. What if the season you have been calling proof God left is actually the season where he is leaving something visible over your life that hell cannot erase? What if the place where you thought you were most exposed is the place where God is naming you more clearly? What if the battle is not only about what you are going through, but about what interpretation will remain standing over it? Will the title be abandoned? Or, beloved, will the title be forgotten or held? Will the title be too late or being prepared? Will the title be ruined or redeemed? This is why you cannot afford to let your season interpret itself without Scripture, because the cross without revelation looks like failure. But the cross with revelation becomes the throne of the King. And your season without truth may look empty, but your season with truth may become the place where God forms something eternal in you. So what does INRI mean finally? On the surface it means Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. But deeper than that it means this: what the world thought was shame, God turned into witness. What the rulers thought was disposal, God turned into declaration. What the priests wanted revised, God left standing. What looked like defeat, heaven named as kingship. And that means when God has decided what is true, no crowd, no empire, no accusation, no dark hour gets the last edit. That is the hope, not that the cross was painless, not that suffering is pleasant, not that betrayal stops hurting, not that waiting becomes easy, but that above the pain, truth can still stand above the blood. Truth can still stand above the confusion. Truth can still stand above the season you do not understand. Truth can still stand. And the truth is not fragile. The truth has a name, Jesus, not merely teacher, not merely victim, not merely example, King. If this speaks to where you are right now, let this settle deep in your spirit. You are not being interpreted correctly by your pain. You are not being named correctly by your delay. You are not being told the whole truth by what it feels like. There is still a word above the wound. There is still a truth above the cross. There is still a king above the chaos. And maybe that is what your heart needed most today. Not an easy answer, but a steady one. Not the promise that every hard thing ends quickly, but the assurance that even in the hardest place, Jesus is still who he is. King in the waiting, king in the silence, king in the public shame, king in the unanswered question, king in the dark Friday, king before Sunday ever breaks. So when you see those 4 letters again, do not pass by them too quickly. Remember what they stood over. Remember who they named. Remember that the world tried to turn a cross into an ending, and God turned it into a proclamation. Remember that truth was not removed just because suffering was present. And remember this for your own life. The story is not over where it went quiet. The season is not empty because it feels slow. The pain is not permission to believe you were forgotten. What looked like contradiction may still be carrying revelation. What felt like silence may still be holy ground, and what stood over Jesus can steady you now. He is still king. He was king there. He is king here. He was king in the blood. He is king in your battle. He was king when nobody understood. He is king in the part of your life you cannot yet explain. So stay with him. Stay long enough to see what the silence was protecting. Stay long enough to see what the waiting was forming. Stay long enough to watch truth outlive appearance. Because above the darkest place, heaven already showed you what it does. It writes truth and lets it stand. And maybe today, above everything you are carrying, this is the title you need to remember. Jesus is still King.